Hey everybody, welcome to my sewing room. Today I'm going to show you how I take a panel and sew it into my one block wonder. So let's jump right in. Making the panel fit starts when you start designing how you're going to lay out your half hexagons. Let me show you how I do that with mine. At the very beginning, when figuring out where to put your hexagons, the first thing you have to do is determine how many columns and rows you need so you don't leave any gaps when it comes time to put in the panel. To do this, the first thing I like to do is to create a control column. I do this with one side only. I pick out a few hexagons that I want to frame the panel and lay them out vertically, slightly overlapping each other to take into account seam allowances. I wanted this bird in the hexagon to be right next to the bird in the panel, so I started with that block. Then I added ones that I thought would match all the way down to the end of the panel. I did the same thing going up towards the top. Before I sewed them together, they were all like this here. I would overlap them 1/4 inch. That way I could get an idea of how long the strip was going to be and how far it would stretch down the panel. Of course, once you sew them, every seam you lose 1/2 inch. So this row will stop lining up with the others. So you have to keep that in mind when you start laying out the rest of your hexagons. Then I sew them all together to create my first column. I put it back up against the panel to make sure everything lines up and to see where it covers the selvage of the panel. From there I know how many half hexagons I need in each column. I only sew this one column, then I finish designing the rest of the hexagons. If I do end up wanting to move a hexagon I've already sewn, it's so much easier to unpiece one of them than trying to unsew a bunch of columns because I need to redesign the whole thing to cover a gap in the panel. I added 2 more hexagons at the top and the bottom of the row, but I'll sew those on later after I finalize my layout. Sometimes I do swap those out from the top and the bottom. Next I want to know how many columns I need to go across the top and the bottom of the panel. This step is easier as you can tell the width of the half hexagon with a ruler. My hexagons measured at 2.5 inches, so when I sew them together I know they would finish at 2 inches. My panel was advertised at 24 inches, so I know I'm going to lose 1/2 inch for seam allowance. I could do 11 rows across, but I like things to be symmetrical, so I went with 10 rows across, which is 20 inches. So I know I will be losing a few inches on my panel on both sides. I wanted this bird hexagon to match with the bird in the panel here. Again, I overlapped the pieces 1/4 inch so I could get a good feel about how many would stretch across. Then I picked out hexagons that would blend well with the top of the panel. I did the same for the bottom, overlapping the hexagons to account for seam allowances. But I wasn't as precise with these, as I already knew from the top that I needed 10 across. As you can see, this one is over by a lot, but by using the numbers from the top, I know how many columns I need for the bottom. I do have some extra hexagons on the side. This one ends here without another hexagon on top of it and blends right into the bush. This one will stick out in the middle. I'll show how I add that one on when I start sewing the sides on, but it's all by itself. There's not one below it and there's not one above it. So the first thing I'm going to do is finish sewing these rows on the side, then this side over here, then my top pieces, and my bottom pieces. When I sew the columns together of the top and the bottom sections, I will have ends that will lay on top of the panel. I want to fold these edges over and I'm going to do that as I sew the columns together. So this is part of my bottom strip that goes right underneath the panel. This is a side piece that will be by itself. And this piece will sit on top of the panel. So I have ironed it over 1/4 inch and I'm going to line it up with this seam right there and sew it with this folded over. Okay, I pinned it and I folded that over so it matches this seam right there all the way down. And that will help me when I want to put it up against the panel to hand stitch it down. Okay, here it is sewed up and pressed open. I'll trim this little dog ear off later. That's folded over, and when I pressed it open, I went ahead and pressed this seam as well because this is going to go against the panel and I'll need to hand stitch that down. I also need to fold this over because there's not another piece to attach it to, and that will be sewn down onto the panel. And I'm going to put a little dot of glue here just to help keep it down. Let me do that real quick with 2 hands. Hold that down, and then I'm going to press this. So this will all be hand stitched onto the panel. And when you flip it over, so the panel will be right underneath here. And again, I need to trim that off. I may tuck it under as I hand stitch it down. I don't like cutting it off right here because I feel like they should blend in with the panels, and if you cut it off you lose some kind of that blending. So I take the time to hand stitch afterwards. So this row is all set up for hand stitching, and then I'll just do the same thing every time I add a row, and I'll keep going all the way across. I'm at the part now where almost all the seams are sewn together. I have a few left, but before I sew the last columns together, I'm going to insert my panel. I have my top ready and my bottom section ready and my 2 side panels ready to go. I have this extra half. Most of the halves were put on the other side of the panel, or on the edges of the quilt top. But this one didn't fit anywhere, so I decided I would blend it in. And I have another one down here. To add these, before I add in the panel, I will take this piece and match it with its counterpoint and then sew it right on the column with a scant 1/4 inch seam. I pinned it like regular, but I folded over the edges to catch them in the seam. That will help me later when I want to applique it down. So when I sew it on, it will just stay on the column like that, with the pretty sides facing each other. I won't pull it out and open it until the panel is inside and it's ready to be folded over and appliqued down. So I pinned it just like my other rows. As you can see, I have this folded and that folded right there. So now I'll sew it and it will just stay like that. I ironed these edges over, but they don't want to stay too well, so I'm going to use a little bit of glue. Then I gave it a good press to help hold the glue. Then I added a little heat from the iron and it's good to go. When you open it, you can get an idea of how it will look against the panel. I have a 24-inch panel and my strips measure 2-inch finished, and I have 10 across the top, so it's 20 inches. So I will lose about 4 inches of my panel, about 2 inches on each side. Depending on your panel, you may decide you want to lose those 4 inches on one side. I may cut off more on this side since I have more space by the barn. But before I do that, I'm going to sew the top to my side panels as well as the bottom. So I'm going to make a little window. Here's my little flap, and I got one down here, but they're going to stay closed for now. Once I have the window sewn, I'm going to put it back up on the design wall because the design wall is nice and flat. If you don't have a design wall, you can use a table or a hard floor. You just want something flat to get your panel nice and flat and to smooth out the sides, so you can start lining things up. I put my panel in here and lined it up with the selvage. But the problem is these side panels are wavy. If I start sewing them on without trimming the panel, it could make some wonky seams that I don't want. So I need to trim my panel before I sew it to the sides and make sure I have a nice straight line to sew my sides to. First thing I like to do is measure the top and the bottom, just to make sure my seam allowances stay on point. In this case, the top and the bottom both measure at 20 inches, so I'll need to cut off enough of the panel to make it 20.5 inches. My panel actually comes in around 23.5, so I'm going to lose 3 inches. Now I just need to decide which side I want to take the most from. I was going to split it down the middle, taking 1.5 from each side, but when I put my ruler up to the right side, 1.5 will take off more than I want. For this particular panel, I don't want to cut off any of the barn, so I decided to cut 1 inch from the right side. That would leave me enough space, even with losing a 1/4 inch in the seam, to keep this side of the barn. I double checked the left side, and if I cut 2 inches off, I still have plenty of space for the barn. So I did a 1 inch, 2 inch split, which would leave me a full barn and some space to spare. It hurts a little cutting off these side parts of the panel. After all, it is part of the picture. I'll hang on to them though and see if I can't squeeze them into another scrappy project. So there's my panel cut to 20.5. Now I need to put it back up on the design. Once the panel is trimmed, I put it back on the wall under the quilt top and line up the edge of the hexagon in the top section with the edge of the panel. I do this on both sides and put a pin in it. I also go across and make sure the selvage is just barely covered. For this one, I had put enough hexagons in my columns to barely cover the selvage on both the top and the bottom of the panel. So I need to take the time to make sure that that stays lined up. Once the edge seams are lined up, I did some glue basting to help keep the top hexagons lined up with the panel. You can pin them to the panel if you don't like to glue, but I always end up poking myself, so I opt for glue basting. If you don't pin or glue baste these center columns to the panel, then the panel shifts and hangs down when you take it off the wall to go sew it. And then you have to realign everything later. So I like to do it while it's flat against the wall. That way I don't have to go back and do it twice. Once I have glue basted the top and the bottom sections to the panel, I fold over my side sections, matching the edges of the panel to the seams of the sides, and I pin everything together. There will be 3 layers at the top and the bottom, but the center only becomes 2 layers when you get to the panel. Do this for both sides and pin generously. This is my panel center and my sides folded over and pinned. Here you can see the extra hexagon in the middle that I added. It's tucked in and will be sewn in, so when you open the seam later, all you do is fold it over onto the panel and applique it down. So here's the back side after the seams are all sewn. Again, the top and bottom section are not sewn at this point. They are only being held on with some glue basting. I like to hand stitch these down. You can machine stitch them down, whichever you prefer. After I stitch them down, I'll trim off the selvage. I wait to do this after I stitch them down so I can see some stitching lines. This helps me make sure I don't cut anything too short and leave gaps. Okay, so this is what it looks like after I trim it. I just rough cut it with some scissors, giving myself plenty of seam allowance. Just enough to get that thick selvage out of there. This is what the back looks like with the panel inserted. And this is the front. You can see how I hand stitched down the hexagons on the top and the bottom. Again, I like to hand stitch these, but you can machine stitch them just as well. These are the 2 extra ones I threw in. They are also hand stitched down. I like doing this if I have extra hexagons. It helps the panel blend into the rest of them and helps everything flow together to go from panel into kaleidoscope. And there you have it. Now you can step back, admire your work, and get ready for the quilting part. I'm really excited how this quilt turned out. I got my panel in, I got my side sewn on. After that, everything goes really fast. I got it quilted up, and I took it out for a nice photo shoot. It's nice to have it finished up. Thanks so much for following along with me today. If you're working on a one block wonder made of panels, I hope you find this video helpful. If you have tips that I haven't mentioned, put them in the comments below. I have several more one block wonders with panels, so any tips would be extra grateful. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy sewing.